In 1952, an archaeologist named Kathleen Kenyon uncovered something in the Jordan Valley that shouldn't have existed. Beneath the ruins of ancient Jericho, she found a stone tower, nearly 9 meters tall, built almost 10,000 years ago, encased in a wall thicker than most modern buildings. It predates the pyramids by 5,000 years. It predates writing. It predates the wheel. And to this day, no one can agree on why it was built. Not because the evidence is missing, but because the evidence points in two directions at once, and neither one is comfortable. For decades, the obvious answer held. This was a fortress, humanity's first wall, built to keep enemies out. Simple, except when researchers looked for what that story requires. Bodies, weapons, signs of siege, they found almost nothing. No mass grave outside the wall. No layer of ash from a burning. The evidence for an attacking army simply isn't there, which leaves something stranger sitting at the base of civilization's oldest fortification. A border that may never have been built to keep anyone out at all. That contradiction is the real subject of this story. Not when the first border was drawn, but why the answer keeps refusing to be simple. Because the deeper you dig, the more it becomes clear that borders didn't begin as walls. They began as something far less visible and far older than anyone expected. Rewind 2,000 years earlier than Jericho, to the shores of a lake that no longer exists in northern Kenya. In 2012, archaeologists working at a site called Nataruk uncovered 27 skeletons, scattered across what had once been a lagoon. Several skulls showed blunt force trauma. One had the puncture wound of a projectile, still lodged in the bone. Hands appeared to have been bound. These weren't farmers, and there were no cities for 1,000 miles in any direction. This was 10,000 years before the first king, the first census, the first fence, and yet the evidence suggests humans may already have been killing each other over a stretch of ground. If that's true, then the border isn't something civilization invented. It's something civilization inherited. To understand why, picture the world these people actually lived in. The lake at Nataruk sat in unusually rich terrain, full of fish, shellfish, waterfowl, in a landscape where such abundance was rare. Anthropologists who study hunter-gatherer societies have noticed a consistent pattern. When resources are thin and mobile, groups tend to share huge, overlapping ranges because no single patch of ground is worth the cost of defending it. But the moment a resource becomes concentrated and reliable, a fixed lagoon, teeming and predictable, the calculation flips. Suddenly, it's worth fighting for. Suddenly, ground stops being background and becomes a prize. And here's where the story takes its strangest turn. Because if Nataruk shows the impulse to defend land, Jericho complicates it almost immediately. If the wall wasn't built against human enemies, what was it built against? One theory, championed by the archaeologist Ofer Bar Yosef, is almost anticlimactic: floodwater. Seasonal rains sweeping silt down from the surrounding hills, threatening to bury the settlement season after season. A wall, in that reading, and wasn't a declaration of hostility toward other people. It was a boundary drawn against nature itself. Other researchers push back, arguing the tower's scale and placement make far more sense as a symbol, a visible, unmissable statement of collective identity, a line announcing, "This is ours," to anyone who might wonder. The debate has never been resolved, and that unresolved tension is, itself, the clue worth sitting with. The very first fortified border in the archaeological record may not have been a border against enemies at all. It may have been the first time a community drew a line, simply to say it was one. If Jericho shows the border as an idea, the next piece of evidence shows it becoming something almost supernatural. In the ruins of ancient Mesopotamia, archaeologists have recovered dozens of carved stone monuments called Kudurru, some more than 3,000 years old, several of which now sit in the British Museum. These weren't crude property markers. They were dense with divine imagery, precise legal measurements, and curses, real, formal curses, invoking multiple gods aimed at anyone who dared move the stone or dispute the land it marked. One surviving Kudurru calls on 7 separate deities to punish a trespasser. Stop and say, consider what that means. By the 12th century BCE, a boundary in a field was already considered sacred enough, fragile enough, that protecting it required recruiting an entire pantheon. That's not a sign of confidence. It's a sign of fear. The quiet acknowledgement that a line with nothing behind it but ink, or a boundary stone with nothing behind it but tradition, is worthless the moment someone stronger decides to ignore it. The gods were hired because the line, on its own, could not defend itself. And behind every one of these markers was a person, not an abstraction. A farmer who had cleared that exact plot by hand, a family that buried its dead in that exact soil, a community that carried, in memory long before writing existed, the precise place where an ancestor first broke the ground. And once, agriculture tied people to one unmovable patch of earth, something nomadic life never demanded. Losing that patch stopped being merely inconvenient. It became something close to losing the people buried beneath it. It would be tidy to arrange all of this into a clean sequence. Hunter-gatherers without borders, farmers who invented them, kings who formalized them into law. But the evidence won't sit still for that story. Nataruk suggests the impulse existed long before farming. Jericho suggests even the first wall might not have been a wall against people at all. And the Kudurru stones reveal that even fully legal and fully sacred borders were still haunted by the fear of collapsing at any moment. What actually connects a lagoon in Kenya to a temple wall in Mesopotamia isn't a single invention. It's the same problem, resurfacing again and again. What happens when something valuable can no longer be shared? Because there isn't enough of it. Or because someone has decided there shouldn't be. Which is what makes the hidden part of this story so unsettling. We think of borders as lines carved into the world, on maps, in stone, in soil. But every piece of evidence here points somewhere else first, to a line drawn in the mind deciding who counts as us before a single stone was ever moved. Kenyon's tower, the bound hands at Nataruk, the 7 gods carved into a Babylonian field marker. None of them are really about land. They're the fossil record of a decision, made over and over, long before anyone had the word for it. And that decision is still being made today quietly, on every scale from a garden fence to a national border, which means the oldest border in human history was never really the one etched into the ground. It was the one drawn, first, between people,